Hello everyone, how are you doing? Welcome back to the Next.js playlist, and today we are going to learn about lazy loading with Next.js. In the last video where we spoke about React query, we emphasized on the fact that all your components may not be server components. You might need client components, and there also you have to think about optimization. One way of optimizing the loading time or the download time of your client components, and in turn all the libraries that you would have imported on that client components, you can manage it by lazy loading. So lazy loading is a way in Next.js to manage your client component optimally loaded based on certain conditions. Maybe for example, when you click on a button, only then you want to load that particular client component, thus only then that particular component will be downloaded on your user's browser, so you optimize the performance over here. So let's get together and learn about how to achieve lazy loading in Next.js. There are a couple of ways that you can do it, but along with that, I am also going to talk about a few nitty-gritties and a few patterns around lazy loading as well. Let's get started. If you like this video, don't forget to post a like, and if you have any questions, post and comment. You know that I get back to you as soon as I can. Please subscribe. Let's get started. So let us start by understanding what lazy loading is and why it is required. Before we go to lazy loading, let's understand what is source code and its bundling. If you have been following my React.js playlist, you probably have heard about this, about lazy loading, and you have learned about it, but let me repeat it in the context of Next.js in this video. So let's say we have source code, and the source code can be JavaScript file, can be CSS, can be your TSX, JSX, or TypeScript, whatever it is. And then you have something called a bundler. So you write your independent JavaScript code, TypeScript code, CSS, and etc. And there is a bundler which is going to bundle them together and create a mammoth JavaScript file or mammoth CSS file. And that's create your bundle. Some of the bundlers examples are Webpack, Browserify, Rollup, etc. Now this bundle with JavaScript and CSS, that has to get loaded on your browser for your application to run. But the problem is the size of this bundle might be really huge. The line of JavaScript code you would have written in the application is too many, and that's got clubbed together by this bundle, even though minified, even though uglified, but still there is a size that you got to download on your browser in the first load, and it might happen that you're making your customer waiting, and finally you get the app running. So this is an experience that user may not like in case your bundle size are really bigger. That's when you have a bundle, you should be able to chunk it out or breaking into multiple chunks, so that instead of loading the entire bundle, you now are able to load the chunks of it, and by loading the chunks of it, the UI loads much faster. So each of the chunks gets loaded, and your user get to see a different parts of your user interface one by one. So this is what is called code splitting, where you have the bundle but you still have the opportunity to split it across and then load it on your web browser, so that your end user doesn't get that monolith slow loading of your application experience, rather get more seamless, more faster experience. The chunks that you see on your screen are lazily loaded on your web browser. What do you mean by lazily loaded? Lazily loaded, it means that when the application is coming up, all the chunks are not loaded at once. Rather, you have an opportunity to load them on demand. For example, if you click on a button, you can load this chunk too that you are seeing on the screen. If you are going from one combo box element to another combo box element, you can load this chunk 4. Maybe initial page load you have loaded chunk 1. So depending on your use cases, you can decide to load this chunk. And with Next.js, it is possible by two methods. The approaches are using dynamic imports with Next/dynamic package. We are going to see an example of that. And using React.lazy with Suspense, we are going to see the example of that as well. But remember, both of these are applicable primary to your client components. Why? Because server components are by default code splitted. You don't have to really worry about code splitting of your server component. You will be worrying about code splitting of your client components alone. However, you can still apply the dynamic imports on the server components, but we will discuss what happens when you apply dynamic imports on the server components as well. Alright, so it's time to get into code and start learning how each of these things happen in practice. Like our previous projects where we have done hands-on coding, I have the Next.js project created using the command that you are aware already. And in this, I have done some little bit modifications. What are those modifications are? Inside the app folder in page.js file, I have removed everything and just kept a div with some basic flex styles and a text called home, nothing beyond that. Inside the global.css file, I have cleaned up everything except these tailwind commands because those styles were really intruding to the application, so I removed them. And then in the layout.js file, I have given a title and a description just for a better SEO of my apps is saying lazy loading in Next.js. And then I have created a folder called components. So please create a folder called components. Inside components folder, create another folder called tom. And inside tom.jsx file, I have created a very simple component. Here you can create any component of your choice. What this component has is a React component having a div, a particular h1. Please create one h1, give some text of your choice and a couple of paragraphs. That's it. It's a pure presentational component, nothing beyond that. So I have a component called lazy tom. I'm calling it lazy tom because I'm going to import it with lazy loading and then I am exporting it from here. So next thing that I'm going to do now is to create another file. It's called tom-story.jsx. This one we are going to create as a client component. So we will be saying use client as the directive, and then let's create the component first. We will call it as function tom story and then export default of tom story, and over here we'll be having our JSX and all. Now what we're going to do, we will be having a button. On click on a button, we will be lazily loading the content of tom.jsx. This is the objective. So tom.jsx, we won't be importing in a usual way like import lazy tom from tom. No, that's what we are not going to do. What we're going to do, we are going to import it dynamically, but we are going to import it with lazy loading. Now here in this example, we are going to use Next.js package called next/dynamic, which is in the background is a combination of React.lazy and Suspense. So in the next example where we are going to see React.lazy and Suspense together, next/dynamic actually doing it under the hood, we are going to take that as our first example. Again, to call out that next/dynamic works already in the page router. If you're working in page router, it works in the app router as well. So if you're migrating from your page router to app router and you were using or you are using next/dynamic, is going to work in app router as well. Let me first import dynamic from next/dynamic. Then I'll be importing a use state because I have to manage a state of a button. So I'm importing use state from React. And here, let me create the state called tom story shown set shown equals to use state of false. That's React. And then return here. Let's take a JSX. Let's create a div. Let's add some classes to it like flex column, some margin and some width. And here let's add a h2. Let's add some class name to this as well. And let's add a simple heading saying demonstrating the dynamic basically. And after this, I'm going to add a button, a very simple button. Let us also add some classes to this button. For example, a background blue, text color white, maybe a rounded corner and a bit of padding. And over here, we're going to add this on click, the on click event handler. And on click, the simple stuff that we're going to do is set shown is not of shown so that we get a toggle effect of it. Again, if you're with React.js, you know this already. And here we can add some text, something like load Tom's story. Tom is a cat in Tom and Jerry, you know. So now this is over, the button is over. Now just below button, here we'll be adding few stuff. If shown, then we have to do something. That something part is what we are going to do using the dynamic import. So let's go up over here. Let's finish the dynamic import part. So here we'll be saying const lazy tom. You can give any name equals to now this dynamic that we have imported. Let's use that dynamic. And in this, we can provide a function and then we can return this import. Here we'll be giving the path to the component that we want to dynamically import. In our case, it is tom.jsx. Tom story and tom.jsx file are in the same folder, which is under the tom folder. So in that case, we can just give ./tom, right? This is enough. But there are a few more things that you can do over here. For example, when this component is lazily loading, on that time you want to give some kind of loading indicator or loading state. So for that there is a property called loading. Here you can pass a function, a callback function, which in turn can return a React component itself, which can say some kind of loading messages. For example, loading Tom's story, something like this. So the lazy Tom, we have this dynamic. Inside the dynamic function, the dynamic that we have imported, we are returning this import, and then the second parameter, as a second parameter we are passing our object where the property loading having a function that returns a particular loading message that you want to provide. Now finally, taking this lazy Tom, in case it is shown, it means the button is clicked first time, I am going to return this lazy Tom from this particular Tom story component. That's it. That's it about this particular demonstration of dynamic behavior. Now how am I going to show it to you? I'm going to go to the page.js file, going to import Tom story from components Tom story, and coming here, I'm going to take up this Tom story over here. That's it. Let's go to UI and see it. But before that, let me tell you that this Tom story is a client component. It has to be a client component because I'm using useState. As I'm importing Tom, though I have not mentioned the tom.jsx to be a client component explicitly, but as I'm dynamically importing it inside a client component, Next.js would treat it implicitly as a client component as well. So lazy Tom is also going to be a client component. Let's go ahead and see it on the browser. All right. So I can see demonstrating dynamic and I can see load Tom story. Now let me press F12. Let me show you the debugger tool because that's where I can show you the lazy loading. And I'm on the network tab right now. Let me just refresh this one, do all. I see a bunch of things are getting loaded already. Now I'm clearing everything and I'm clicking on load Tom story. Do you see what happened? Tom story got loaded. There is a fraction of second where you saw loading Tom story. But the beautiful thing over here is only after clicking on this particular chunk is getting loaded, which is nothing but the tom.jsx file. Now let's do it again. Refresh. If I click on it for a fraction of second, the loading will come, see, and then you get the lazy Tom. And then only this guy is coming. Before that, it was not getting downloaded. It was not getting loaded on your browser or on your application at all. So this is an example of lazy loading using Next/dynamic. Let us also see React.lazy with Suspense. Now to demonstrate the React.lazy, I have created another folder under components called JD, and I have created JD.jsx, a simple presentational component like tom.jsx. Who doesn't know about the Tom and Jerry story? So this JD, again, the same kind of component having a div, a h1, a couple of paragraphs. That's it. Now, similar to Tom's story, let us create another file called jd-story.jsx. And over here, I'm going to create the lazy loading using React.lazy. So for that, first of all, I'm going to make this as a client component, and I'm going to import now React and useState, and we'll be using React.lazy and Suspense. So we need React explicitly, and we also need Suspense from React. After this, we are going to import our lazy JD, almost similar fashion, but the syntax is different here. React.lazy is what we're going to use. And over here, the stuff is simple. Here we're going to again return the import, and we are going to import the JD component. So the JD again in the same folder. So /JD is enough. If we had JD in other folders, we would have given the appropriate path to the JD. And after the imports, let us create the component. We will call it as JD story. And inside the component, as usual, we'll be taking the similar kind of state like last time, set shown. Now from here, let's do a return. What JSX we're going to return? The similar kind of JSX, the div kind of div that we had last time. Inside the div, let us add a h2. And this time we are saying demonstrating React.lazy, not dynamic, because last time we did dynamic. And over here, we'll be adding the button again. Let's add some class names. This time a ping button and an on click, of course. In the on click case, we will be doing set shown and not shown is what we are going to do because we're going to toggle it. And as a button text, just like Tom's story, let us say load JD story. And then after the button, here what we can say is like if shown, only in that case. Now we are going to use suspense. If you are new to suspense and error boundary, I have a video created in my React playlist explaining suspense and error boundary depth with lot of examples. You must watch that. The suspense, what it takes a fallback. So until you have the component completely loaded, you want to show certain kind of loading indicators or fallback. In the last example, using dynamic, we have done with the loading property. In this case, you have to do it using fallback. So here with fallback, I can give any other React component. So I'll be doing like h1 loading JD story. So this is the fallback. And in case there is no fallback, everything seems to be completely fine. So everything is loaded. Here we can say lazy JD. That's it. That's it, our component. Now, similarly, I can go to the page.js file and here I can do import JD story, and just after Tom story, let me import JD story as well. Let's go back to UI and I see both Tom story and JD story appearing over here. Tom story was working as it is. Now the time for JD story. I'll go to F12, bring the network tab back with all selection, and now I'm going to click on load JD story. You saw the loading indicator and you're also seeing the JD.jsx is getting loaded only when I am clicking on this particular stuff. If I click on this, I'll have Tom, but it is not showing now because it has already loaded. If I again reload this, a hard reload, I clear everything off, click on Tom story, the tom.jsx got loaded, JD story is got loaded for JD as well. So you understood the second methodology as well for lazy loading with Next.js. But now there are certain corner cases, certain patterns, certain nitty-gritties that we want to discuss. If you're a fan of Tom and Jerry, you also know there is another character called Spike the dog, right? So we are going to do something with Spike as well. What we are going to do? So for all the imports that we have made, for example, if I go to components, go to Tom and go to tom.jsx, it's a default export. Default exports mean you are exporting along with the default keyword, and while importing, you can import it with any name of your choice. But there is another kind of export import is called named export, named import, where you don't give this default keyword and you have to maintain the name using which you are exporting a particular React component. With the same name only, you have to import it elsewhere. Now, for importing this particular component using the dynamic import and lazy loading, the things were like this. You were using the import function and then you were giving the path into that. That's it. You didn't have to do anything. Optionally, we were also giving the loading property for a better user experience. But if you are doing a named export instead of a default export, Tom was default exported. If you are doing a named export, then you have to do something extra over here. That is what I'm going to show you. So for that, I have created a component called Spike. Spike.jsx, exactly same structure. It has a div, inside that there is a h1, then there are a couple of p's. Only difference between Spike, Tom and Jerry is the Spike is not default exported. You won't find the default export over here. Rather, it has named exported. You are using export const the lazy Spike, the name itself. So if you're doing the named export, let's see how are you going to import it and what kind of changes we'll be bringing in. In this case, I am going to show it with next/dynamic, but the same thing applied for React.lazy as well. So let's go ahead and create a new file called spike-story.jsx. Straight away, I'll mark it as use client, and then let's create the function spike story. That's our component. Inside that, we will take use state, and for that, I'm going to import use state and I'm going to import dynamic also, just like last time. And now I'm going to create a state called shown, just like last time. And I'm going to do a return a JSX over here. Now this JSX is gonna be exactly like the Tom's one. So let's have a div. Inside the div, let's have a h2 which says that demonstrating named export in this case. And then we'll have the button just like last time. The button will have some class names. This time let us have a slate color class name, text white. And then I'm going to add one on click. Going to do the same thing for toggling. Set shown is not of shown. And let us add a spike and its story. And over here, again, we are going to do if shown then we will do something. We'll come back and do something over here. Now is the time to lazily dynamically import spike. So do const lazy spike equals to, again the same dynamic function like last time, again a function that actually return import, and again here the path slash spike. So far so good. But for named import, there is a difference. The import returns a promise. You have to resolve that promise using the then. You know how to resolve a promise using the then. And over here, the value that you get is the module, the actual module. From this actual module, you extract out mod dot the actual function name. For us, the function name is lazy spike. All right, so this is the only difference that you will be doing compared to what we have done for Tom. And after this, as usual, we will be also taking advantage of this loading, and over here we'll be using a function that returns a particular h1 which says loading spike story. So now if quickly I open up Tom's story and see it side by side spike story, in case of Tom's story, I just did an import. I didn't have to do extra promise resolution over here for the default export and import. But when there is a named import happening for a named export, you have to resolve this promise, and resolving this promise, the value we get the actual module. From that module, whatever you are name exporting, our name export, if you remember for spike story, for the spike one, the name export was lazy spike. This is exactly the thing that I am giving over here called lazy spike. Now after this, I am going to take this one, coming over here and giving this component as a return if it is shown. That's it. So this is the difference between a named import and a default import when you are importing using default or React.lazy for lazy loading in Next.js. So finally, what we will be doing, we'll be exporting the spike story from here. Let's open up the page.js file, import spike story, and then add spike story over here. Let's go to UI. So we have spike story now as well. And if I click on this, I see loading spike story, and I will see spike JSX file is also getting loaded. So now to see things overall, if I just refresh things, load Tom story got loaded, load Jerry story got loaded, load spike story got loaded. So everything is getting loaded dynamically, lazily. So that's the one that I wanted to talk about the nitty-gritty. Now one pattern that I'm going to talk about for server component, it is by default taken care. By default, it is code splitted. You don't have to do anything additional. But in case you want to use it for your dynamic loading, you can still do it. You won't get any compilation error. But there is one thing that is going to happen. If the server component having any client component as its child component, then when you import server component, the client components will be lazily loaded. The client component which are there as a children to the server component, only those component will be lazily loaded. On the server component as such, you don't have any impact at all. So this is what I wanted to kind of call out as a pattern that you have to remember. Unnecessarily don't really use on a server components because it is already taken care by Next.js. Now before I end, I want to end with one question and answer. You have seen a great improvements for loading client components lazily, right? You're loading them on demand. So it means that this Storm component, Jerry component, Spike component is not loaded in the beginning on the first load or the initial load of the application itself. Thus, it is not bloating your application. It is not downloading a lot of stuff. It's a great improvement and the optimization. But should you do this all the time? That's a question. No, my answer is no. You may not be willing to do this all the time and by default. By default, you can keep aside the dynamic imports. You can go with your client component as usual. You want to bring in optimization only when it is required. For example, if you have a client component that is by default very heavy, you know that if that particular component is getting downloaded on the initial load of the application, your user has to wait. You have to put extra loading indicator on the entire application so that the particular client component gets loaded and then only your user is able to see the data on your UI. That case, you would think about lazy loading. Or you have a client component where you have imported a library. That library itself is so heavy, like Lodash or anything, which is like very heavy. You have imported the entire library in that instead of a tree shaking. That case, you probably want to do a lazy loading of that particular client component. So take the decision based on your need. Don't really blindly go about using dynamic imports all the time and try to over optimize your application. With that note, let me bring conclusion to this particular video. I hope you liked, and if you have liked, please subscribe, like this video, and post your doubts, post your comments into the comment section. Sooner I'll be back with another video. Stay well and keep learning.